bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on, because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand. And nobody was really bothering to explain it to me. And I formed a bunch of opinions about the town and about the people in it that were like, surely that couldn't be. And then you find out later on the track that you are exactly on track.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Ryan Research Podcast. Today, I'm interviewing a pseudonymous writer, Post Apathy, otherwise known as Ahmed. He writes about modernity, technology, economics, and how it all connects to the past and the lessons we can learn from it. You can follow him at all the links below, and I hope you enjoy today's talk. All right, I'm here with Post Apathy, otherwise known as Ahmed. He posts a lot on Twitter. You can read his blog and all the new ideas that he's coming up with. So I'd like to say thanks for coming on. How are you doing, Ahmed?
Thank you for having me, Peter. I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. So I wanted to have you on because we intersect a lot with a lot of ideas we keep getting at. We find critiques in the way modern systems are perpetuating themselves, the sort of neglect of traditional historical precedents of what worked and maybe what's being forgotten, and also a synthesis of those things to try to find an affirmative solution to progress going forward and not just return to some backward technological status or to then go full bore on the other direction into some sort of transhumanist kind of no guardrails environment. So I think we share a lot of that. So I think as a first question to start us off, can you define what is post-apathy?
Yeah, so I can't remember exactly how I came up with that name. I think I was just looking for something catchy initially, but it does sort of encapsulate the sort of spirit of inquiry that I pursue, in the sense that, particularly in online spaces, for instance, a lot of younger male demographics, the sort of people you'd be expecting to be full of energy, going out into the world, building new things, and so on and so forth, have this abject lethargy towards the world and the direction that their communities and their societies are going in. So the topics I tend to write on, they are mostly focused on action, less so critique, although I will often preface my argument with the critique just so people don't get lost. But the thrust is, we know what the problem is. How can we go around working together to produce solutions to these problems? And a lot of the time, it's not about producing new solutions to things. It's about rediscovering the wisdom that we used to have, and that used to be passed down, but at some point, whether advertently or inadvertently, was cut off, and then we sort of became unmoored from this wisdom, and here we are in this lost state, this apathetic state. And my goal is to reverse that situation, to not only rediscover that wisdom, but then to acquire the sense of agency and ownership over the world, to make the world we want to see.
Yeah, and a lot of what you're talking about resonates with some ideas that I've been recently turned on to of, not to go too deep, but Martin Heidegger, he has this idea of thrownness, of who we are, what's our identity, and what is our state of being. And the fact that traditional liberalism will discuss the individual as being a point in time, a totally empty slate that can choose anything and that has sort of the world open to it. It does not answer that question of thrownness, where we all find ourselves in, as you're discussing, this idea of being disconnected from history, being unmoored from certain values and ideas. And so regardless if we want to believe X or Y, or we want to preserve this emphasis on individualism, the state is always thrownness, is that we are up in the air, we are being sent somewhere, which we did not ultimately control the initial thrust. And so coming to terms with that, and as you say, trying to get past the apathy or the sort of anxiety, the disgruntlement, comes with this idea of we need to understand where we were thrown from and where we're being thrown. And ultimately, that there is some autonomy in that arc of we can maybe redirect or alter the course.
Yeah, so I like to say that every idea has a context, just like a seed has its soil. And so the idea is shaped by its context. And the sort of ideas you're talking about here, these are sort of the ideas that were popularized by many Enlightenment philosophers and then systemized in the 19th and 20th century by the European nation state. This idea that we are, as modern people, we are separate from the past, we are superior to the past. And so we need to get rid of everything that came before us. We need to cut our ties to that past, and we need to live in the present and for the future. So this idea, which dominates, thought across Hegel and Marx, the idea of this sort of linear progression of history, marked by technological progress as being the moral arbiter of a society. This is sort of the core worldview of the modern world, right? So I've talked a bit about techno-salvationism, for instance, on Twitter and in articles and newsletters. And so this techno-salvationism that we see today, maybe you'll see it with the rationalists, for instance, that community, or even Elon Musk, he's a massive techno-salvationist. These ideas are actually pretty old. They're 200 years old, at least. So they've been around for a while. And they've all been premised on this idea that we need to cut ourselves off from history. It's not good enough to say we don't want to go back. We need to affirm our rejection of everything that isn't modern. And so for me, I don't really have an interest in return, so to speak. I don't want to go back. What I do want is for us to no longer, being in that state of thrownness, but we have no past or future. We need to reinsert ourselves back into the timeline of history. And that requires humbleness that you won't really find among, modern ideologues, if you will. We need to accept that actually we've got a lot wrong over the past century or so. And the only way to identify a way out of this mess is to look at what we try to destroy from our history and our traditions, identify the wisdom in them, reconnect ourselves to those, these lineages of knowledge, and then we can launch ourselves into the future uninhibited by the mistakes of the present.
Yeah, and who are some scholars or writers from the past that you find are particularly interesting and informative for how we move forward?
I think one of the biggest ones, I guess, and this is one I've talked about previously, is going to be Ibn Khaldun. And I find that his cycle of history is the most compelling theory of history. It's the major alternative theory to the linear history and moral progress based on technology, blah blah blah. And it's one that actually has historical evidence. Unlike linear progress, linear progress is sort of it's heavily dependent on the past 200 years. Cyclical history we can find sort of happens on a sort of a pendulum that swings throughout history in every era. You can sort of identify these general, rise, apex, decline phases in empires and societies. So when I look at today and the disintegration of society and atomization and so on and so forth, these are things that have happened before, and the decline of empires and so on and so forth. And Ibn Khaldun's idea of these barbarians in the desert who sweep into these decadent, disintegrating societies is an extremely compelling idea to me. Also biologically, I guess, as well, sort of makes sense. You can see that today in America, actually, which is constantly renewed by these influxes of immigrants from third world countries, people who don't really involve themselves in the nonsense of, modern first world people and their anxieties and general softness and so on and so forth. But these migrants have this sort of vitality in them that can sort of stave off the worst excesses of American consumerism. They also bring with them, obviously, their ability to build families and maintain those families. So that also pushes back, for a generation at least, social disintegration.
Yeah, I actually have his book up here now, and in the introduction, I find this one paraphrasing of his idea is pretty interesting, where the preface goes that civilization is always and everywhere marked by the fundamental difference between urban and primitive, producing a tension that is also an interplay between nomad and merchant, desert and city, orality and literacy. And I think that kind of gets at what you're discussing, where there's maybe the inner core and then the periphery and the exchange between them, or you could also say decadence and vitality. But also then what are, as sort of that paraphrasing gets at, sort of other distinctions that make those decadent or vital? Like, is there something about ruralness? Is there something about being at the centers of power and meritocracy that corrode?
I mean, people will take different lenses to this. So some people will apply a moral lens, and so they'll identify things like atheism or sexual degeneracy and so on and so forth as being the primary reasons for people's decline. Other people will take a political approach and say that the reason is the rise of another competitor who is more vital and who has better organization, and they use these things to purposely sabotage the existing power and then overthrow them. And then there are economic arguments at the micro and macro level. So at the macro level, people will argue that there are just these conditions of history that cannot be resisted. For instance, the opening of the New World, that domination, for instance, the Middle East, which lost its monopoly on trade between China and India and Europe, thanks to the opening of trade lanes by Europe to the entire world. That's sort of a macroeconomic view. And then maybe there's sort of microeconomic, where you're looking specifically at the state's mismanagement of irrigation or taxes and so on and so forth, that lead to the destruction of a people. And then that just opens them up to pretty much any predator that lies on the edge.
Yeah, so there's always an edge. There's always sort of a force there. There's these distinctions that arise, and as you sort of reference, sort of past empires and dynamics that happened there. Now we live in sort of neutral empires. We live in this era of globalization on a very bureaucratic, technocratic path. And so even though we acknowledge that there are these merits to globalization and through economic gain or whatever it might be, knowledge transfer, that it certainly is being done with not a heavy hand. What is it about today's globalization that might be reminiscent of those older forms?
I mean, we're sort of in uncharted territory. We can, to an extent, rely on the history of political relations, for instance, or just basic human nature to have an understanding of where the world's heading. But I think it's an interesting question. For instance, okay, so let's take globalization, for instance, and economic progress. There's this question of, once all the countries have industrialized, where do you go to industrialize next? How do you keep, capitalist profits high, keep the system going, and so on and so forth? Because our modern economic system rests on going to, these vital areas on the edge and then industrializing them. And then once that's happened, we sort of move on like a locust plague, right? What happens if you eliminate all the edges and everything is integrated into this one great whole? That's sort of one of the things that I think aren't discussed enough. And it's one of the things I think ultimately will cause severe problems in a short amount of time, because you can only sort of pass the buck so many times around the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think what this gets at is like these fundamental questions about the end game of capitalism, of liberalism, of questions that no one really dares to answer. I think they're just sort of concerned with the real time, whether it's an axiomatic motivation to basically preserve some sort of idea within, like, we have to have individual autonomy. You cannot let an authoritarian state sort of decide things vis-a-vis an individual, or it's, this is just pure utilitarian gain. But once you play this out and you get to that like end game utopia, there is really no consideration of what happens next. Like, what happens when, for a lot of developing nations that are driven by export-led development, what happens when you become dependent upon those foreign consumer markets for your goods? What happens when your population is growing in numbers or in quality of life that demand more out of those foreign markets? Do you increase foreign markets? Do you find ways to leverage more that you can squeeze out of those foreign markets? So it's very much left unstated. And that's what I'm trying to figure out myself of, okay, well, what happens in the end game? How do we actually create a sustainable system? And I think this has a lot to do with these unexamined theories. I think one of the guys from the past that we probably both enjoy quite a bit is the economist from the 19th century Germany, Friedrich List. I think he makes a lot of good points about this idea of trying to connect to history, of identifying sort of sovereign units versus sort of global or axiomatic ideological systems, but ultimately, as much a critic as he is of his observation of modernity, of all these trends going forward in his time, he ultimately said, well, no, we have to basically do this alternative version to that. But once we're grown up, his famous argument of infinite industries, once those grow up, then we can enter back into the sort of free competition, laissez-faire, liberal capitalist utopia in the endgame, where every nation has their own equivalent industrial capacity. So no one is sort of disadvantaged against the other. But again, he leaves that unexamined as, you know, what happens when we get there? What happens when population changes? What happens when culture changes? And there's different ideas of how to kind of ebb and flow of the borders or of the resource demands. Now, I would say, before I turn it back over to you, is it's an open question if Friedrich List actually believed in that endgame by the twilight of his life when he wrote this book, The National System of Political Economy, his famous main text. If he really believed that, as he did in his younger days as an advocate of liberalism, or he was sort of compromising to some bit with critics of him of his day, where he said, look, I'll throw you a bone here, eventually we'll get to it. And whether or not he actually believed there would be that end game, or just be a perpetual state of sort of protectionist of national competition, yeah, it's left to be thought about.
I think it's a bit faux pas when you're talking to economists or reading economics to mention or even to prioritize basic understandings of human nature, one of which is conflict, and our sort of natural impulse to evolve and to tribalize at any given opportunity. I think one of the main problems with orthodox economic theory, and this goes for both, you know, all the capitalist and communist strains, they refuse to engage with the sort of nitty-gritty realities of conflict and competition as being a primary driving force, not just across history, but in terms of our daily decisions we make, whether that's economic decisions within the state or, you know, economic deals with another state. Conflict is always on the mind of the decision maker. But when you read economic theory, it's sort of this extremely abstract treatment of the world, of trade, of incentives, that ultimately what will always prevail is the incentive to trade and to industrialize. And I think that's one of the attractive things about List, is that, as you mentioned, he does leave the end game sort of out there for interpretation, but the core of the theory doesn't ignore the fundamental realities of existing. And that's one of the first things that attracted me to his writing. It's just appealing to see an economist take the gritty realities of human nature seriously.
Yeah, that's where I find him refreshing. Not in the sense that he's this biased or partisan, or you could say dogmatic preacher of a version of nationalism or any other sort of tribalism that you could think of, but especially because he's coming from someone that admired Adam Smith, that was a liberal in his youth, to these real hard, harsh truth facts of life. And he's just trying to work with that and not really have an ideological dog in the fight. I think he recognizes there's conflict here. There's obvious holes in the logic of what, at his time, Britain was promoting around the world as, hey, this is how you industrialize and you improve your nation's economy with the actual history of how Britain did that. And that's where he became, I think, more enraged at just this hypocrisy of trying to perpetuate this global system that underneath it all preserves this core periphery sort of subtle imperialism. Not so much that we have English troops in Germany or France or America dictating what the economic policies are, but through their education systems, their media, and also the credit systems, there's a lot to be said for what the discount rate was vis-a-vis America and the development thereof, where the English were buying American securities, this and that, the other thing. But all those planks considered, there was this subtle imperialism of trying to keep these nations from developing to be competitors with England. Yeah, so he takes conflict seriously. I think, one of the useful things about then pushing forward into the 20th century is that a lot of the sort of East Asian tiger economies that everyone looks very favorably at, there seemed to be this appreciation of List, and also this appreciation of the fact that we're going to do with it what is objectively good to create some forms of autonomy within our economic spheres, and deal with the realist world that if we stay perpetually in this place of like comparative advantage, as the West tells us to, let's say in subsistence agriculture, cash crop, mono economies, we're not actually going to move up and develop sort of more productivity, we develop higher manufacturing capacity, and really have the ability, after all of that, to defend ourselves, our sovereignty, and our way of life.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there are a select few East Asian countries that picked up on this, that adopted a sort of neo-Listian political economy, while most countries in most emerging economies fail to understand these things, either going for sort of like full-blown socialism or going along with the sort of IMF model, particularly in Africa. I think Africa is interesting today because these countries are now learning, not from the West, but from East Asia. They've seen the success over there with the sort of protectionism and the importance of manufacturing and industry, and sort of heavy dose of preferring nationalism to like globalism. So you've got countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, although Ethiopia is in a civil war or something, I think, lately. So less so, but Ghana as well. I think Ghana's apparently doing quite well in West Africa at the moment. These are some of the African states that have abandoned the IMF model, but also they're not going, sort of like a whiplash back to socialism as it was instituted in the 20th century across many emerging economies. They are going for this neo-Listian understanding of economics, protecting the industries that are important to them, building state capacity, not hollowing it out, which is another important thing. And again, this is something that standard economic theory has neglected, is the importance of state capacity and the ability of decision making, to get things done and to work with the market. The state actually works with the market, not against the market, to create this prosperity.
Yeah, I'd be interested too to hear your thoughts on, like you mentioned, how they're learning from China, and in particular, Africa's doing this. I was just reading a New York Times article about, I believe it was like about a $400 billion trade deal China did with Iran. And, even though different contexts, different regions, similar pattern of China being this sort of patron of a lot of these nations that still need more development. And one of the funny things in it is that here you have China, which, we're told in the West to be very fearful of their communist tendencies. And China is stipulating in this trade deal with Iran that there needs to be these free trade zones set up within Iran that gives more autonomy and liberalization in terms of the affairs of Iran's state with that of the foreign Chinese interests that are coming in there. So, isn't it funny how, regardless of any ideology, just the nature of conflict in terms of who's big, who is small, who has more resources, who is not, is actually the determining factor for what ideology you kind of use at home and abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. I think today's examples are very good, and they tend to be ignored because they don't fit into standard assumptions and models. But for instance, what China is doing in Iran, as you mentioned, is a prime example of what Britain was doing around the world in the 19th century: protectionism at home, free trade ideology abroad. Um, it's it is an example of the primacy of politics over economics. Economics tends to sort of pride itself, they see themselves as the cleaner discipline that aren't involved in the nitty-gritty, backwards, conflict driven human nature. Instead, economics is all about aligning incentives and making everyone rich. But across the board, doesn't matter whether you identify as a capitalist or a communist, you tend to use the same tools to achieve the same things, such as soft or hard influence over a country, such as in Iran. I think crypto is an interesting case like this. So this is going off slightly in a different direction, but crypto's origins are in libertarian ideology for the most part. This belief that crypto would decentralize everything, eliminate state power, and so on and so forth. And conversely, accelerate globalization as well, because you're breaking down these trade barriers by getting rid of these intermediaries and legacy institutions. However, from what I can see, crypto tends to fit quite neatly into our assumptions about conflict between nations. So, for instance, between America and China, one of the current sort of FUD narratives is that Bitcoin could be weaponized by China against the United States, and therefore the United States has an interest in either regulating or even outright banning Bitcoin and crypto in general. But looking at their sort of positions and the tools at their disposal and how they want to wield these tools, China experiences more capital outflows than the US does. Right, Chinese capital goes to USA, American property, for instance, Canadian property, British property, right? So the Chinese are interested in tools in which they can reduce this outflow. Crypto isn't one of them. Crypto is a tool that will actually accelerate these outflows. On the other hand, with America, they want to accelerate outflows from the world, not just in terms of capital, but also labor. America is an immigration sink. I think it's easily, contrary to popular narratives, America is the most immigrant-friendly nation in the world. No other country in the world accepts that many immigrants or integrates them as well as America does. These are just facts. You can't go to Japan or China, for instance, or Singapore and do the same there. You can't do it in India. It's just America. And then to a lesser extent, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Europe isn't too friendly to migrants. Anyway, so America wants to accelerate outflows from places like Russia and China. crypto is a perfect way to do that. And it fits well within America's sort of modus operandi to encourage other nations to adopt policies and technologies that promote, liberalization. Um, and crypto is a tool for that, really. And I wrote an article actually on that, cryptocurrencies return to tradition, and in that piece, I did discuss the effect that crypto would have on these quote unquote paper states with their paper money, fiat, um, and that the US would actually stand to benefit while most of these states would, once crypto sort of matures in about 5 to 10 years' time and sees mass adoption in places like Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and so on and so forth. Those states whose central banks are based on fiat are going to face crippling problems with capital. And I think people underestimate the strength of the US and the US dollar in remaining stable over the next few decades as we see even more currency instability around the world.
Yeah, that's all very fascinating. I would like to circle back to Friedrich List for a bit and move on to crypto, but to just comment quickly on that to like bring them together. It seems like just as Friedrich List kind of criticized England for saying, "Oh, look, now we're free trade too. We've gotten rid of our tariffs, and we're perfectly happy to compete on the world stage with everyone else's business." Meanwhile, the entire point of the tariffs and protectionist policies is for nations that are less developed, less advanced, to actually build up that competitiveness. So in a state where you've already done that, as England has, and other states around you have not, and you all enter into free trade, you will perpetuate that uneven system. In a similar way to what you brought up with crypto, it's almost like the US does not care about moving into free trade, laissez-faire, no tariff environment vis-a-vis crypto in terms of, hey, yeah, everyone just use this anarchic cryptocurrency because they are an immigration sink. They are a capital sink. They are the hegemon of finance and all other trade manners. So there is really no fear. They sit at that pinnacle of everything, whereas every other nation has less sophisticated, less developed monetary fiscal regimes or trade regimes that, yeah, they can perpetuate crypto while at the same time maintaining or strengthening their own systems at home. But so to leave it at that, and we can come back to the crypto point, but I would just probably like to conclude with List on, do you think, just as we have these archetypes such as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, for right-wing, liberal capitalism, laissez-faire, free market ideology, and for the left, we have Karl Marx, we have Lenin, we have others that represent that wing. Is Friedrich List and those that have followed in his tradition, are they worthy of really rising to this archetype standard as sitting equal to that of Adam Smith and Karl Marx?
I think perhaps a century into the future, it may very well be seen that Friedrich List is this critical third pole of economic thought in the modern era, considering that it is his style of economics that built the United States. It's one of the longest living empires in history, one of the longest living modern federal states, the most, the greatest economic power in history, built on neither Marx or Smith, but on the ideas of List. And then his sort of tradition of economics, as it gets abandoned in the West, it goes across the Pacific and then participates in the building of the next wave of big, prosperous, successful economies. I'm wary of archetypes and turning things into like memes and things like that. But I do think he is worthy of recognition on par with either Smith or Karl Marx.
Yeah, I think that archetypes, memes, they can obviously lose their details and become unwieldy. But I think it serves to kind of create a new breakthrough in sort of the rhetoric, the way that we think about these things, because so much of productivity, sovereignty, all these questions kind of sort people into camps, and thus, like, if you're against, let's say, imperialism as a smaller nation that has been on the other side of that, you're kind of sorted just automatically into maybe a left-wing ideology with everything that's attached to that. But even still, it's, what is really the driving force of it? And what do you actually, if you gain some sort of autonomy, end up doing? And this is where there's a cool book I just came across too by this old Harvard professor called Roman Sporzlik. He's Eastern European origin, and his book is called Communism and Nationalism, Karl Marx versus Friedrich List. And there's this paragraph in his conclusion that he makes that I thought is like, it hits on what I just said. It hits on sort of what you just said of like, is List actually underneath everything sort of the most important in the idea that he's actually responsible for everything that's worked? And so this is where Sporzlik comes in and says, the contemporary ideology of national liberation accordingly differs from older forms of nationalism in that national liberation includes social transformation of an anti-capitalist kind. In that doctrine now current in the third world, says McFarlane, social revolution is an integral part of the very concept of national liberation. McFarlane attributes this stand correctly, in my view, to Marxist-Leninist influence. He also notes that the doctrine of national liberation is characterized by a statist approach to problems of economic, social, and cultural development, consequently leads to a concentration of power. McFarlane recognizes that this third world ideology shares Friedrich List's belief in national economic independence, but he thinks it is anti-Listian in its opposition to capitalism. He also acknowledges that the national liberation doctrine is distinct from Marxism in its fundamental commitment to national identity. One might say that the national liberation revolution is national, not only in form, but also in essence. So I think that's what gets at a very interesting thing here, where we can look at, as that paragraph describes, sort of third world, decolonial, Marxist-Leninist ideologies we see proliferate in so much of the way that they're against imperialism, they're against being dominated. But actually underneath that, so much of it is derived from Friedrich List, and there's actually very little that's maybe Marxist in actual practical implementation. And then similarly, we go over to sort of the right-wing capitalist side with the East Asian economies, where we look at Taiwan and Japan and South Korea, and we say, oh, well, these are models for capitalism. These are models for, how liberal democracies in the capitalist vein have won the debate of the 20th century. But really, again, the same thing. When you look underneath into the details, you find there's many Listian policies. There's a lot more state guidance, maybe less so planning. And so, yeah, that's where it serves to come back to this idea that wherever we look, we find Friedrich List associated with sort of what works regardless of any ideology. And in that vein, he is hugely impactful, but even so more, he's so under discussed that we need to sort of rise him up or resurrect him in a sense, to actually have the vocabulary to push these ideas forward in an affirmative sense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there have been some attempts over the past few years to popularize his ideas. Um, haven't been altogether successful. For instance, the American Compass, the right on policy and things like that. They've adopted a sort of neo-Listian approach, but I think it's colored too heavily by the culture wars in America at the moment. So it loses the vitality of List's ideas once again by using it as a Trojan horse for particular ideologies. Another example is Ha-Chun Jiang. I think he's a professor at Cambridge University in England. He's very good at it. I've seen some of his videos, I've read some of his works. He's working quite hard to sort of popularize Friedrich List. There's also, I think, to a lesser extent, although it's not explicit, it's more implicit, American Affairs. They're a pretty great magazine. I enjoy reading that one. They adopt a sort of neo-Listian approach, but again, using it as a Trojan horse for, sort of culture wars. So what I'd like to see is more sort of skeleton work done on List himself, on the analytical tools and concepts that he uses, starting at the core really and bringing those ideas to life instead of immediately attaching them, from birth at the hip to whatever ideological movement sees him as most convenient today. Maybe something like Friedrich List Institute for Economics. That would be really cool.
Yeah, if anyone's listening, happy to get that project started. But you're totally right in that Han-Jun Jiang is very much the modern disciple of List, and his book "Kicking Away the Ladder" is a direct quote from List, National System of Political Economy. Although I will say there is times that Jiang can be a little understated in sort of bringing up List, and there's probably obvious reasons for that. But I do find what his work is doing, what some of the other people around that orbit are doing, very good in trying to bring these ideas forward and being honest about it. And that seems to be one of my also kind of things that I dwell on constantly, is like, who is being honest? Who is dealing with, rather than cynical or, camouflaged ideologies, who is actually willing to let the chips fall where they may and say the thing that is true. But yeah, so I think that is our take on List. And to now move forward into what you were getting at with crypto. Crypto presents this new world of how we think about money, how we think about the state's role in it, about trade flows. But also it's a return in a way. There is a cycle when we consider hard currency, when we consider the 19th century and turn of the 20th century gold standards. What is it about crypto that is reminiscent of the hard currency era, and what is different?
Yeah, so that's a good question because I don't really know. I think we're really 10 years too early for to see what exactly crypto is capable of. What we're seeing now with cryptocurrencies and NFTs are very, very early alpha stage use cases for this technology. I think they're rather poor use cases for it, but like anything, you've always got to go through this period of trial and error. one of the things that really interests me about crypto is that there is this sort of historical tradition of currency pluralism. So, for instance, in medieval kingdoms, the central authority, usually the royal dynasty, would mint its own coin, and that would sort of be the main coin of the kingdom. But because of the sort of porous nature of nations at that time, you'd have a bunch of different currencies circulating. So there would essentially be uh, baskets of currencies. The idea of having this single currency printed by a central bank is something that really has only arisen in the past 70 years or so in the post-war order. Um, and what crypto is enabling. So crypto isn't, it's not a technology that has just emerged in a vacuum. It's an emergent response to the disintegration of a particular regime that has existed in the post-war period, politically and economically, and even culturally in terms of the state's monopoly of cultural production. Um, and so currency, the monopoly on currency by these states and central banks as this sort of blip of history starting to break down. It's a failed project essentially in most of the world. And so crypto is this sort of, it's a response to this failure using the tools at hand, i.e. computers and cryptography, um, to recreate some of the things that have worked in history, such as this basket of currencies, which it's similar, I guess, in theme to our discussion earlier on, sort of reinserting ourselves into the timeline of history, looking back at our failures in the modern period and saying, actually, we didn't do so well with this thing. We need to go back and understand the wisdom of why they did those things and then see how we can apply those lessons today. I think crypto, if it's used in a proper manner, if it's deployed appropriately, will play this sort of role in bringing back the idea of having multiple currencies in one economic system, and also across many economic systems as well. So it will accelerate both globalization and the sort of deterritorialization of the nation state. So there'll be more localism. It's like a barbell model, I guess. But sort of the nation state as the center, the central bank with its monopoly, those are going to be things of the past in the very near future across most of emerging markets.
See, I would agree with quite a bit there, but I think it would be interesting to orient the frame of that discussion of the history of central banks. Also in this idea of, well, what is a central bank and what is its connection to the state or whatever national or whatever particular identity that is associated with it. I think what you end up seeing in the time of, let's say, 1850 to 1950, 1970s with and further on for other developing nations, this idea of creating these central banks, and are they independent? Or are they embedded within the framework of the state of the particular identity, and ultimately guided by those in terms of objectives and goals? So I would say that if you have an independent central bank that is preserving policies that are detrimental to whatever your particular group is, that is where there's some failures. I mean, there's of course the technical aspect of, can any policy set actually be impactful? And that's a separate conversation. But in terms of what is the purpose? What are the mandates? Who are they accountable to? I think you do have this idea that there were discrepancies between what is a national central bank and what is an independent central bank. I would look at the examples of, let's say, Germany and Japan, of creating these sort of embedded central banks that have national allegiance and that will guide credit to their most directed purpose, that will control inflation, but also not curtail stimulus so that the nation kind of goes into a stagnation. And then when I look at how, my particular expertise right now is looking at Ireland's independence as sort of a case study, when it came time for them to implement monetary policy, if they should enact a central bank, there was a lot of conservative reaction to the idea of it. And for the first about 20 years of independent Ireland after its revolution, they chose to not have a bank, but to have a quasi-currency commission that regulated banks, sort of, that controlled some of the money distribution. And it was very strange. And then ultimately, by the 30s into the 40s, they decide to have a central bank, but very limited and very prescribed to a very conservative and ultimately English perspective on how you go about that banking. And having an English perspective in an Ireland that's seeking to be independent is problematic for obvious reasons. But ultimately, what they did policy-wise, that they failed to create a monetary system that was conducive to Ireland, that was a less developed nation that needed to have a weaker currency vis-a-vis other nations, where England obviously was preferential to a stronger currency that benefited it, but hurt the Irish ability to sort of be competitive in terms of manufacturing and goods abroad. And secondly, the direction of capital. And capital was not guided towards proper industrial development. It was hoarded. It was directed to foreign assets abroad. And these were all tools that were available and also conducive to the original revolutionary ideas that guided sort of the forefathers in that critical 1916 to 1922 period. So that's where I would say there's more of another rethinking, similar to how we go back to List and Marx and Smith, and we kind of bring List back out. I think there's this vision of, okay, but there's hard currency, and then there's sort of this authoritarian state centralized bank. But there's another conversation to be had of, well, what is actually the proper definition of a central bank? Is it this independent, very conservative, very sort of within the purview of the imperialist structure that has no advantage for that of the periphery? Or is it actually conducive to the periphery and their national development?
Yeah, I mean, can a central bank ever truly be independent as a tool of monetary policy? My disposition is probably to say no. Maybe there are examples where I'm wrong. I'm not too clued up on the history of central banks worldwide. But I think it's interesting that the example you mentioned with Ireland, for instance, that sort of the situation that Turkey finds itself in today, with its own currency crises, where the government doesn't necessarily want the strengthening of the lira because it's going to damage their ability to industrialize and their ability to boost exports. But obviously that then sort of exposes them to problems with the US dollar, with the short sellers, and so on and so forth. And looking at also the desire of people in Turkey, it tends to be that they care less for, sort of this longer term ideological goal of industrializing the nation, and more that they want parity access to the US dollar for immediate comforts, whether that's property or transferring money abroad or going abroad or whatever. So it's little things like this that, beyond sort of abstract strategies, can influence the direction of a central bank. There are all these games being played at every level. So I'm quite cautious around them as an instrument, but I do agree with you that a lot of the criticism of central banks, especially since the rise of fiat, is sort of it's a knee-jerk reaction, because when we had the gold standard, things are very unstable then as well. So hard currencies are not necessarily the panacea to our problems today. I'm not sure how crypto will affect this relationship in the near future. As I said, it's really early to be making any sort of judgment. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, and the story also of the development of the United States is also a debate between basically the coastal elite creditor class who prioritized this hard currency perspective and into whether it was stable or even deflationary, and the sort of frontiers entrepreneur class that was heading out west and seeking inflationary money that would better pay back the debts. And so you could say, okay, well, that maybe is deceptive on their part, but it's also part of, well, how else are you going to develop, land that's currently not modernized? You need sort of the guidance of money as an imperative force, as I remarked in a tweet earlier, as sort of like a language mechanism to sort of direct people to do something. And the paper quantity value is almost irrelevant to the idea that, well, once there's people out in a given territory that now haven't built it up, have created some forms of industry, of agriculture that have created value, that productivity, and returning back to List, that productivity level is actually the value, not any sort of transferring back and forth of paper numbers. It's the actual concrete productive capacity. But again, that has always been sort of this debate, and there's always this incentive structure you have to look at. Well, who does stable and deflationary currency benefit? It's ultimately creditors. And who does inflationary money benefit? And it's ultimately people that are entrepreneurs, people that are productive, people that are creating new value. And then moving forward into crypto, I think that this all presents an interesting version where, okay, well, now everyone can create their own money, and there's like an inflationary aspect to that, not in the sense that Bitcoin's supply cap can be adjusted, even though it can, but that anyone can make a crypto, and the total amount of money tools can increase and stimulate economic activity. But I would say that there's a fundamental, again, failure to beg the question of what happens in the end game of these things and what their ultimate hierarchies are. Does crypto actually serve as a long-term solution to all these problems and creating a new world system that is powered by these anarchic, laissez-faire, quote unquote, decentralized currencies? Or are these ultimately sort of tools that are beneficial to those involved to guerrilla finance as those involved in guerrilla warfare, in guerrilla kind of insurgencies, in that those are paths for a particular time in a particular context that ultimately, after winning a various revolution of any insurgent group, they would never suggest that they have to continue the same actions that they were doing in those guerrilla contexts. And so thus is crypto constrained to the guerrilla context and ultimately can never actually power a state, power an actual established entity.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the idea of an end game, there's a quote that comes to mind, and I think it's something like, the most visionary people are the most reactionary, um, in the sense that there may never necessarily ever have been any sort of end game. The point always was, in creating these revolutionary technologies, was really at its core an act of spite, just to wage guerrilla warfare against them and then get them out of power. But what happens after that, it's left for that time. We'll figure it out when we get to it. So it's a very sort of piecemeal approach to things. And I think ultimately that's why I'm hesitant to make any pronunciations on crypto as it is at the moment, because if it does achieve its current stated aim of revamping the global financial system, by the time it reaches the end of that, what it will look like will be very different to how its founders and proponents imagined it. And then ultimately, it's highly likely that we'll see another movement rise up that attacks the efficiencies of crypto, and then we play the same game over and over again. It's like a line from Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. And so it's the same story being played over and over again, but the curtains and the suits are different.
Yeah, and I think this all also intersects into like the idea of like, where does money come from? Is it ultimately originated in the sort of spontaneous order of the marketplace, or is there a fundamental connection to the state, or if you don't like that word, to the dominant hierarchy kind of pinnacle? Whoever is at the top of that hierarchy is ultimately the determining factor in what is money. So like that it becomes an open question with crypto, as those people that are sitting at the top of crypto's hierarchies, who are they? What role do they play in the monetary policy of these cryptos? What role do they play in shaping non-monetary ideas and directions for people to go in? And this is where I think, it's hard to maybe decide like what is and what is not a state. And this brings us nicely into the intersection of this idea of network states, of crypto states, of startup cities, which we're kind of running probably close to the conclusion here, but I would like to get your take on what also this adjacent movement of network states and startup cities represents, alone and also in the context of crypto.
Yeah, so earlier I said that crypto is sort of a emergent response to the failures of the existing system. So I think the other ideas, for instance, like charter cities, is again an emergent response to the failure of governance, particularly in emerging economies. I think ultimately what we're seeing is pre-modern patterns of social, economic, and political organization being refitted with this new technological layer, a more fluid form of existence breaking out of the sort of rigid confines of the nation-state model. The nation-state and its model of economics is like a geographically confined, singular-bodied machine. But what we need again which is what used to exist, are multiple overlapping geographically agnostic networks, like mycelial networks, um, that paints the world, finds the world in its own set of webs. This is a much more fluid understanding of things. It's at once more local and more global, cutting out the homogeneous middle. Um, and so what we're seeing, we're emerging now out of the 20th century model. You know, as Peter Thiel said, 21st century has just begun in 2020 with COVID. And COVID exposed the fundamental weaknesses of pretty much all of our institutions whose roots are either in the 19th or 20th century, and the sort of hierarchical industrial forms of human organization. And we're looking for the legal tools, the economic tools, the political tools, the cultural tools now to break that model, to go for something that's more multipolar and complex than what we've had before.
Yeah, and to bring us full circle here, how do you think Friedrich List plays into this movement? Take away whatever you want to define as nationalism in his sort of conceptualization of what his system was, where you can kind of strip it of its association, just look at it from the point of view of, well, it's particularism. It's about that there's local units, however big or small they are, or what their components that make them up, ultimately kind of doesn't matter in terms of his tool set. What matters is that you have this unit of analysis that is competing on a world stage, that has rivals, that has conflict. And these are the tools you do to kind of basically preserve that unit as a sovereign entity. So I guess, like, where would you see any ideas of List being beneficial to the startup cities movement?
I think the most important thing is when List compares two families in his work, The National Economy. So one of these families is engaged in consumption and interest. The other family is engaged in the cultivation of productive powers. So the first family who is involved in this consumption, they see existing wealth as a means to generate wealth, and so they become lazy. They don't develop the skills um, and the innovation required to build up their productive power through education and trades. They just, it's this financialization which List criticized and which today dominates, the Western hemisphere. Most Western economies are based on consumption. As a result, our productive powers are collapsing. They're being outsourced to places like China and so on and so forth. And he mentions that the effect of focusing instead on productive powers, learning new skills and innovating in technology, learning trades and so on and so forth. The effect of this is that, quote, mental forces and talents are awakened and cultivated, which increase from generation to generation. So this is a multi-generational scale. This is something you can apply at the family level, at the tribe level, at the nation level, and so on and so forth. So it's not restricted to the national ideal of List. So I think this is one of the most important things, is that people start to focus on acquiring the skills and the knowledge of what is real, what has real value, as opposed to trapping themselves in this world of financialization, when nothing has value anymore, where your currency is inflating, where people don't know how to do basic tasks anymore because we've outsourced it for so long. We've simply forgotten.
And this is interesting because so much of the discourse within how do you create a startup city? How do you maintain it? How do you attract people? Circles around, well, we'll just have very low regulations. We'll have very low taxes or fees that someone may pay to reside or do business in it. And everything else will take care of itself. Whereas if you contextualize it in the dichotomy that you just put, where you have sort of financial interest and you have productivity interest, we've seen areas that have tried to kind of replicate that as sort of these money laundering, tax haven states, going back to Ireland in the modern sense. So much of Ireland's economy, it's a small nation. It's not exactly a startup city. It's not exactly a startup nation, but it's a small nation that has sought to use these economic loopholes to attract multinationals to basically just reside capital in their nations, and have promoted themselves as sort of these areas of the future of this is how you do commerce, and we're attracting services, we're attracting kind of innovative ways to kind of grow the economy. But what we see underneath is that ultimately this is all fictitious paper growth, that these multinationals have no real incentive to invest in the country and are just simply, again, parking money, which overnight, if a global tax system changes, which Joe Biden right now is basically flirting with, that completely erodes whatever Ireland is doing with its own policies on taxes. So they lose that advantage, and then all those multinationals leave overnight. The Ireland that comes the next day is something very different. It's something that is revealed to be hollow. It does not have its own domestic industry built up. It is reliant on all these multinationals for so much of their economic growth and whatever manufacturing and kind of concrete services that they do provide. And so if we look at that analysis, then again, go back to startup cities, it's almost like there needs to be a real priority on productivity versus just allowing people to kind of move capital back and forth through these entities. Because one, there's already entities that exist like that. And two, that is not exactly what the meme of the startup city is. The meme of the startup city is to build things, to create industriousness, to create new technologies that are being prevented elsewhere. So I would say where we might ultimately conclude, where we bring some sort of Listian influence into the startup cities movement, is that productivity needs to be the emphasis and not financialization.
Absolutely, yeah. And to top it off, I'd also say, going back to Khaldun, who shares many similar ideas with List, Asabiya is also important. You need to have, an understanding that ultimately there's an actual people there, that this is their homeland, that there is no other homeland, and so they have to take care of that one. And so when people look at, especially charter cities people, and they look at cities like Dubai, for instance, or Singapore, these places didn't arise out of nowhere. They had pre-existing populations. Those populations remain there to this day, and they dominate there, whether they are the majority in the case of Singapore or even the minority in the case of Dubai. Those people are still there, and they don't expect to leave, and they do things in their own interest, right? So it's not a neutral tax haven. The rulers of those city-states are extremely shrewd rulers. They invite MNCs and expats for a reason. They know how to take their capital and then reallocate it internally. And so this sort of shrewd self-interest, it's probably a faux pas to mention it in the charter city circles, but ultimately this is going to be one of the defining principles of between charter cities that ultimately succeed sometime this century, and most that will fail because they lack this, and they just, they sort of want to be another Monaco or something.
Yeah, and I think, again, to just like bring everything totally full circle, we get back to the idea of Heidegger's thrownness, and we can't simply start a startup city with a population, and then consider it sort of this data point that's discrete, or even if we can suggest, well, this is a founding stock of entrepreneurs that are coming to create this new entity of a startup city. But 10, 20, 50 years down the road, if these things are successful, again, you find the population in that startup city thrown there. They did not exactly choose to grow up in a startup city, or now have this weird homeland attraction to what is a corporation, perhaps, or or something that is, explicitly in neutral terms. Oh no, this has nothing to do with the old ways of the past, of tribalism, of this or that. But again, those people 50 years down the road, they are thrown there, whether they like it or not, and they are situated in a context that requires them to act in their own interest, and requires them to also want to be independent, have their own autonomy. That requires policies, as we've outlined, that nurtures that, rather than just being sort of a subservience class to maybe an elite financial interest that sits on the top of these cities, or some other form of periphery entity that basically serves the interest of a larger nation or structure that it's a part of. So these are all questions that would definitely be interesting to see other opinion makers in this movement comment on and really deal with, because I think you and I both agree with the motivation of it, that there's something wrong, there's something that needs to be done, there needs to be solutions and not just criticism. So yeah, I think that's hopefully a little contribution that we might make with this talk.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for having me, Peter.